everyone. My name is Ben Eady, and I'm the Online Media Manager of ModernAnalyst.com, the premier online community for business analysts. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar titled Agile Collaboration to Improve Requirements Productivity. Today's featured speaker is Derwin Harris, and we also have Ashley Lund from JAMA Software. And the webinar will last approximately 60 minutes, including the Q&A session. So make sure to submit your questions in advance using the questions feature of the webinar software. I'd also like to say thank you to JAMA Software for sponsoring this event. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Derwin to get us started.
Thank you very much. So hello, everybody. I'm just going to do a quick audio check. Hopefully, I come across loud and clear, and you can see my screen. If it's not the case, let us know through the questions. So yes, today we'll be discussing Agile collaboration to improve requirements productivity. Now that is certainly a mouthful, and there's a lot of information contained in that one sentence and a lot of things to cover. The focus for me today is really around that idea of collaboration and the impact that it has on our ability to be productive in what we're working on. And for those of us here, it's my assumption that most of us are either business analysts or product managers, or that we work in some way around requirements or product delivery. And so really today is focused around how collaboration can improve that process. Moving the screen forward. So one thing I want to highlight is that this is actually a two-part series. Today, as I mentioned, I'm going to be focused on collaboration, whereas I have another webinar coming up on December 11th that will be focusing on the effectiveness of that collaboration around traceability and requirements management. So ultimately, I'll be tying everything that we learned today with this idea of how do you actually take that and apply it to the real world, to the world of your data, the data that you're working on, all the different teams and artifacts and how it's connected together. I split these apart because I was getting a lot of questions around collaboration and really what does it mean in today's day and age. And so that's the goal of today, is to really focus in on that concept and understand that more and how it impacts your day-to-day. So as I mentioned, I'm Derwin Harris. I'm currently a product manager here at JAMA Software. I'm also one of the co-founders. You can certainly reach out to me if you have any questions. I encourage feedback. I love to get feedback about these webinars. Did it make a difference? Did it resonate with you? Anything that you also have to add to it, I'm always interested, and I incorporate it into future webinars as well. One of the things that, just a bit about my background, is I come from a development background. I've been a project manager. I've been a solutions architect. And the real thing, the benefit I've had and the pleasure that I've had of traveling the world, working with so many different companies and really experiencing how they are managing product delivery, how they're implementing requirements, how they're ensuring success. I've even seen some of the struggles that they've gone through. And that's been just a wonderful experience from my perspective to be able to see all that and learn from all the different types of methodologies that are being applied and what works and what doesn't work. And so I've really taken a lot of that knowledge and applied it into these webinars. JAMA Software as a company was founded back in 2006. And we really founded the company around this idea of solving these problems. We recognized the fact that the world was really changing, and the ability to do product delivery in a better way was changing. We wanted to enhance that or implement that better through the product that we provide called JAMA. We currently have 600+ enterprise customers, and those customers are all customers that we love working with, and a lot of them are in a lot of different technologies and areas such as healthcare, semiconductor, ranging from Agile to waterfall, a real wide range of different types of companies. So that's been really fun to work with. So the big question is, why are we here? The thing is that over the last decade and longer now is that we've been going through an evolution, but the process and the technology and the way in which we work hasn't necessarily changed. The world around us has. So really what today is to focus on is to bring those two worlds together, how process and the lack of connection that we have is intersecting with and colliding with this world that's much more mobile and highly, highly collaborative. You think about how people are interacting today, it's so incredibly different. Yet in the business world, in what you do at work and how you operate at work, that is not necessarily the case. And so what we're going to see going forward is a lot of those concepts really blending in with our day-to-day work. And what I'll be focusing on today is how that works. And this brings us really to the big word of the day, which is collaboration. And I know we've heard this word used a lot. It's really become quite a buzzword. And so the big question is it a buzzword, or does it provide real business value? And that's one of the things we'll talk about. Now, I found this quote, which is an interesting quote, and it was a study that was done to sort of understand the benefits of co-location. You know, what benefits do people get from being in the same room together? And this is the greatest quote in my mind that I found out of that article. But this was a study that was done around the co-location of teams and the impact and benefits that that provides. And this quote, I think, really calls out a lot of interesting elements that I think are relevant. And so the quote is, leads to increased knowledge and information sharing and promotes the feeling of involvement and inclusion of each team. Now, the things that I want to focus on is the idea of knowledge, the idea of sharing, the idea of feeling, because ultimately a lot of what I'm going to be talking about is that there's an emotional component to collaboration that we really need to be aware of. We can't whittle this down to science. There's a lot of emotion involved in this process. Involvement and inclusion. There's so much about this quote that just calls out the benefits and a lot of the concepts that I'll be talking about. Because ultimately what we gain from collaboration is we gain knowledge. We gain the ability to feel more involved, and this ultimately connects us to or enables us to be more productive. So let's do a quick poll, because as I dive into this, one of the things that I'm really interested in understanding is whether or not you consider your team or your company to be collaborative. Of course, this is based on your current understanding of collaboration. But one of the things I'm interested in knowing is, do you consider yourself collaborative? My guess is that a lot of folks are going to say no. I think there'll be a range of folks that say, we're kind of collaborative, and there may be a few that say yes. We'll see if I'm wrong. So far, I'm seeing a lot of people saying yes. This is fantastic, actually. So I'm realizing that I should maybe ask a second poll later on or maybe at the end of this, whether or not you feel that the type of collaboration that I'm talking about is relevant, or the type that you're going. So this is great, actually. So 68% of you said yes, 32% of you said no, and it looks like none of you said kind of, which I find really interesting, because that's so clear, right? For you to know that you're collaborative versus that you're not collaborative is actually interesting to me. That I would have expected there to be more folks who thought you were kind of in that mid-range. But that's fantastic. So one of the things just to keep in the back of your mind is that a lot of you who have said, the 68% of you that have said, yes, we're very collaborative, at the end of this webinar, I'd love to just go back and maybe assess that and determine, do you agree with that statement still as we go forward? All right. So what is collaboration? Collaboration is, in my mind, a part of social. And the reason I bring this up is that we're going to use the term social throughout this presentation. But the reality is that what social means, or it means things that are different to a lot of folks. We think of social as kind of Facebook, we think of it as Twitter, and that doesn't bode well for the business world. Ultimately, when we think of social, social is the combination of sharing, discovering, and collaborating around information. That is this idea of being social. To collaborate isn't necessarily social alone. It's part of it. There's a phase that we have to go through where we're sharing information and we're discovering information. And what happens in the middle of that is this idea of collaboration. Without sharing information and without the ability to discover information, there's no way for us to collaborate. This may seem obvious, but it's going to play a role in how you manage your requirements, because if your requirements are being done in a document that isn't available to folks, how are you going to discover that information, and how then are you going to be able to collaborate on that information? The context of what you're collaborating on, the collateral and the data that you're collaborating on, is really critical, and that's somewhat of a subtle difference between the social world and the business world, which I'll get more into. Now with that, there's different roles of collaboration. There are creators and there are consumers. And this is interesting to just keep in mind, because you may be both. You may be one type of person. As a business analyst, you are definitely a creator. You are creating requirements. The key is to what degree or how well are you sharing those requirements such that other folks, the consumers, whether it's the customers or stakeholders or other members of the organization, to what degree are they able to discover that information such that you can have a collaborative conversation around that data. So again, just having that mindset of, am I sharing this information such that it can be collaborated on? That's the beginning of successful collaboration, is just understanding that idea that there's creators and consumers and there's sharing and there's discovering before even having the ability to collaborate. Now, there are different modes of collaboration, and I've talked about this in a previous webinar, but it's interesting to keep in mind because I think that there's one of the myths that I'm going to talk about is this idea that collaboration is noisy, that the tools that are out there today that provide more collaboration is going to create a noisy environment that's difficult to manage. The reality is that you're using modes of collaboration today that already do that on many levels. So email is a classic example of a tool that's currently being used for collaboration because you are sharing information via an email and then it's showing up in someone's inbox, so they are discovering it and they're replying back to you. So that is a form of collaboration. IM is another great example of a collaborative tool. Meetings are, in fact, another version of collaborative tool. I even call out the idea of a drive-by. This is incredibly pervasive in a lot of organizations where people simply walk up and tap you on the shoulder and ask you a question regardless of whether or not you had time to answer that question. So I like to call this the drive-by. And then last is this idea of business social software. And this is somewhat of a new category that's sort of been coming about in the last 5 to 8 years. There's been software for requirements management, but that's different than business social software, which is combining this ability to collaborate around the ability to manage your requirements. And that's really the focus of today's conversation. But let's look at the pros and cons of the different mediums that exist or the different modes. Email, as we've discussed, is widely adopted. It's known. It's just exists in every single organization. Nobody even thinks about email not existing. It's pervasive. The problem is that it's incredibly narrow in terms of its scope, its ability to collaborate as a collective, as a group. You know, I send an email. I might send it to 5 folks. Those folks are now stuck on the reply all chain. It's not a true conversation. The other problem is that that information is typically lost. It's dated. It's hard to track. It's hard to find. It's not tied to any relevant set of data. We're passing things around sort of in the ether. IM is also targeted. It's known. People use this in a lot of organizations. The problem is that it's a lot like the drive-by. It's incredibly distracting. And again, the information is quickly lost. Once the conversation is done, the conversation is done. There's no ability to go back to that conversation. There's no ability for someone who wasn't part of that conversation to see what the end result of that conversation was. Meetings have benefits of the group consensus, you know, the fast interacting group conversation that takes place. It's highly engaging. You can gain a lot and learn a lot in a meetings. But the problem is that there's oftentimes scheduling conflicts. You know, we have maybe too many meetings, or I'm not on site, or I'm remote, or I'm on vacation. The other problem with meetings is that the information is oftentimes lost. We've had this great meeting, and we all walk away feeling incredibly inspired, but nobody took a photo of the whiteboard. Nobody wrote down any meeting notes, and those meeting notes end up in a document stored on some SharePoint that nobody can find. It's lost. And the drive-by is great for that instant, hey, I need instant gratification, and it's a very me kind of concept. I want an answer, and I'm going to go get that answer at all costs. The problem, obviously, is that it comes with a cost. It's very distracting, and again, the outcome of that is oftentimes lost. And that may be okay. It may be that you needed an answer, and that answer is never going to be asked again. But one of the things I'm going to touch on is that collaboration in a business world has longevity. There's a historical context to it that we should be mindful of because it's what's really going to drive the productivity gains that we're looking to get. So business social software is obviously has benefits in association to this. The fact that it's historical, the fact that it's tracking the conversation, the fact that that conversation is available to anyone who comes in later and has access to it. It's also typically designed to do what it's supposed to do. For example, Jama Software, we build a product that's designed to help you collaborate around requirements. And so whereas IM is not designed for that, it's designed for a very specific concept. Email is also designed to simply be used for email. The other benefit of software is that it can be designed to be more collective. It can be more inclusive. People can chime in who aren't necessarily immediately part of or invited to the conversation. The problem with the software is that it's fairly new and it's not yet universal. So we get into this realm of adoption, unlike email where everybody uses it. To really gain from the benefits of social software, you want everyone on it. Facebook would not be what it is today if there weren't people on it. And as we're hearing, teenagers are dropping off, so its value is potentially going down. So there's an element of making something universal to be successful. So something else I want to really touch on is these concepts of business social versus social media. Again, this term social can be confused with social media, and we see if you do a search for social media, you'll get a lot of marketing, how do we benefit from Facebook, how do I use Twitter. That's different than your world, which is really focused on the business side of things. Your job is to produce or help facilitate the building of products. You're writing requirements, you're writing epics, stories, whatever the methodology that you use is tied to these artifacts that you're trying to capture so that everybody's in alignment with what you're trying to build. That's a fundamental difference between business social and social media. The other thing I want to highlight is that when we talk about business social, the conversations in that are much more meaningful. That is, I'm having a conversation around content that I deem meaningful. And I'm going to really stress that word meaningful because that's so critical to what I'm talking about when I'm talking about collaboration. We're not just simply having conversations for conversation's sake. We're having conversations around meaningful content. And in association with that, we're having, or we desire, or we require meaningful responses. This is very different than, say, social media, where the posts or the information that people are putting out there isn't necessarily meaningful. It could be interesting, it could be relevant, but it's not designed to produce or provide an impact to something down the road. And the responses are also not necessarily meaningful. You know, the fact that, and this is actually a post that I did last summer, this is long gone. It no longer matters. It's a tomato that I did over the summer. I was excited about it. I got some likes. I got some responses, and that was thrilling for me, but it wasn't necessary in terms of my success or not. So I think there's a fundamental difference to be looked at and to be understood. And that fundamental difference is that the collaboration that we're doing must have a purpose, a reason, a point, or a justification associated with it. Why are we collaborating on this information? What value is it providing? And what's the end goal of that collaboration? We can't just simply say, well, we're having more conversations. And this is fundamental to the myth that people have that it provides or it causes more noise because they think, oh, everyone's just going to come in and chime in. It's just going to be chaos. The reality is that when dealing with business, collaboration is done around this idea of purpose, reason, point, and justification. And I just have a definition. I think I got this from Google. The reason for which something is done or created or for which something exists. There is a purpose around this. Unlike my tomato, which is just simply out there for the sake of being out there, there's no real purpose around it other than maybe self-enjoyment. So let's talk about a real quick example. An example of, and this is just going to demonstrate sort of why technology or the world that we live in has changed. Because the reality is times have in fact changed, right? We've gone from, and I think I went a little too far back with the computer, but my dad actually had one of these. And then you've got the sort of the way in which we operate today, which is drastically different. We've evolved or changed how we communicate. This is hugely different, and it's having an impact on your world in the business world. let's take an example. So let's just say this is back in 2000. You know, mobile phones weren't around. There was cell phones. You know, they were starting to evolve. They were pretty much the flip phones. So we were able to talk. But ultimately, when we were having conversations about meeting somewhere, let's say I was going to meet someone at a game, and I reached out to them. We talked over the phone, and we came up with a plan. And that plan was, I'm going to meet you at this point in time. I'll meet you in front of the place. And so we made those plans very detailed, and we had limited options to alter those plans because the technology available to really adapt to those plans didn't really exist. Well, nowadays, when you look at that same concept and you look at how we interact as individuals, as humans, it's fundamentally changed. When you make those plans are so much more vague, so much more fuzzy in the details that they're providing. You can have a call with someone and say, hey, are you going to the game next weekend? Yeah, I'm going to the game. Okay, I'll see you there. That's all you need to discuss, because as you get closer to the game, you're able to nowadays have much more instantaneous interactive communication throughout the process so that you can connect with that person closer and closer to the point where you actually meet at that location, whether it's via text or whether it's via the cell phone. All those capabilities provide a much more interactive functionality. Now, this is important because it enables you to really adapt better to an ultimate change that may occur. And so here's an instance where I showed up, they weren't there, I got stuck in traffic. Who knows what happened, but the reality is that I ended up delayed, but we were able to readjust our agreement or our location on the fly. And so this is important to sort of recognize, because this ties to the idea of Agile and the benefit of Agile. A lot of people get confused in thinking that Agile as a methodology is so much about changing the process. Okay, we need to start writing epics. We need to start having stand-ups. We need to have stories. We're going to have a burn-down chart. Those are the elements that they think of when they think of Agile. What they don't think of is the fact that we have the means to have constant communication such that we're able to be a little bit more fuzzy at the beginning so that we can adjust more completely at the end of the day and ultimately end up at the correct location rather than a predefined location that we could potentially miss. So really, what has changed? What's changed is the modes of which we communicate. The technology itself has changed. The willingness of individuals to communicate on a different level, the adoption of that communication, such that we've gone from it was the younger generation to now Facebook, as I've mentioned, is has a much more older demographic, and so that mindset has dramatically changed. I think my mom joined Facebook just a few months ago, which is always scary, and she's starting to text me now, which is sort of a new change for her. So we're seeing that the mindset and the adoption of these different social mediums is dramatically changing, and yet we're not seeing those changes fall in line on the business side of the world yet, or it's slower. And so what we're seeing is that over time, the other thing that's really happening is that the products that we're building are getting increasingly complex, and the speed of which we're trying to get those out the door is becoming, or it needs to be faster and faster. So you think about, iPhones, you think about Tesla, you think about rocket ships, even software that we're building, it can be done in a much more faster continuous development process. So a lot of these complexity is increasing over time, whereas the technology that enables us to really adapt to that and interact with that and accomplish that speed and that complexity has been evolving also over time, has been increasing, but it's slightly behind in my mind at this point in time. So early on it was all about meetings, and we suddenly had the ability through WordPress or through documents to actually capture the information, and then all of a sudden email and the internet came around where we could share information back and forth, and it just revolutionized and enabled us to be faster. Well, now we're in a new revolution where the mindset, and it's somewhat of a social revolution as well as a technical revolution, and they're merging together to create this new concept of true instantaneous, interactive, collaborative efforts to enable us to be more reactive and to respond to change a lot faster. But it's not all roses. There's always going to be drawbacks. There's always going to be learnings. I know that even with emails we'll talk about, there was a point in time where it was problematic, and there was a lot of effort to try and train people on how to use email. So here are some of the risks, and for me, words are probably the biggest risk. The fact that we're now relying on words rather than the face-to-face, more so than the face-to-face. Now, it's not to say that face-to-face goes away. It's to say that we're going to be doing a lot more collaborating, just like we are today through social media in our workspace. So there's some things to consider with the words that you use. There's cultural considerations. There's translation considerations. There's simply the interpretation of what you're trying to get across. There's an emotion tied to what you're saying, and that emotion comes across. No matter how much you try to remove emotion, there's always emotion in how we write information. Oftentimes there's use of humor, and the use of humor can go one way, it can go another way. It just really depends on why you're using humor for that point in time. And I'm not to say that it's not acceptable in the business world, but it does come with potential consequences if not done right. There's context associated with that if you're talking about something and you're not providing enough sort of information, you're talking to someone and there's maybe an inside understanding, but recognizing the fact that the content or what you're having a conversation around could be viewed by other folks, it changes how you write that information. There's little nitpick things like the use of quotes. I've seen people use quotes to reference what somebody said. I've seen quotes used to be sarcastic, and sometimes that comes across as such, and that changes. You think about the emotion of the person on the other end. Things like double question marks. It's like double question marks in my mind is like yelling or poking somebody more aggressively, and of course there's the classic all caps. Now, it's funny because a lot of this, if you remember, there was a huge amount of dialogue and debate around email etiquette. I believe about 10 years ago, how to write a good email, what's right and what's wrong, and should you using PS or should you use hello or hi. There's all sorts of, and it's just become a common understanding. I don't see emails that are poorly written, rarely, but yet I see social posts that are dramatically different or more open, because social has ultimately trained us to be more free and maybe even a bit more sarcastic. We're bringing sort of what we do in that social world into the business social world, and I think that there's going to be a slight adjustment there to just understand that there is in fact a difference. The reality still exists that there are dispersed teams. They're not always in the same place, and this is always going to be challenging. Collaboration can definitely help bridge this gap, but it isn't a silver bullet, right? The reality is still that they're dispersed. Now, there's ways in which you can overcome this by providing more visibility, by providing more frequency in which people have access to information. I think personalization goes a long way. This is a huge benefit of social software like avatars and profiles. It really connects us on an emotional level because, again, this is something I just want you all to consider, is that no matter what process you have in place, you're ultimately asking people to accomplish the expectations of the success of the project, and how those people work together is so critical to that success. And yet we've kind of lost that with this emphasis on process, as if process is somehow going to override the emotional component of our organization and solve all our problems. So things to think about. Tools as well can be a problem, but be careful when thinking about this, because it can confuse the problem. It's easy to blame tools over process. It's easy to blame process over tools just as well, and it's easy to blame people over process. It's just really taking a good look at what you're doing and looking at all these different components. What is your culture? Who are the people involved, and how do they like to work? How do they like to interact? What is the process, and what are the tools in use, and do they work seamlessly together? Because that's ultimately the consideration that's at play here. So let's look a little bit at personalities, because when we think about collaboration, ultimately the people involved in understanding the different types of personalities out there makes a big difference in how you interact and how you adjust your organization, your culture to adapt to that. So I think that there's a lot of articles and some great books and a great TED Talk. I forget the lady's name, but the introverts versus extroverts. The idea that introverts oftentimes think before they speak. They're really good at one-on-ones, but they don't do so well in meetings. Collaborative software actually benefits introverts a lot because it gives them that time to respond. It gives them that time to think about what they're saying and not being put in a situation where they kind of close up like that happens in meetings. Extroverts are the opposite, where they express ideas openly. They thrive in these group environments, and to be honest, they also can thrive in collaborative software because it provides them a platform for their extrovertness, right? And it feels like a group when you're on a collaborative software versus I would expect that introverts probably cringe with email because it just doesn't feel like a platform or like a place where they're able to really express this information openly. Makers versus managers. This is something that Paul Graham sort of highlights, the idea that there are makers and there are managers. And this, again, is something to really consider. And it's even in the preparation for this webinar, it struck me that I hadn't ever thought of this, that makers are really the developers, the engineers, the people building, even business analysts who are writing these requirements. There's a high switching cost in being pulled out or being distracted from what you're working on. You're a very focused type of individual. You're in the mode of making and building something, and they don't make good time managers. That is, they're not good. They need to focus on those things, and time management becomes difficult, especially when you've got people like managers running around who love their meetings, they love multitasking, they love change, and they're the biggest culprits for the drive-bys because their day is simply a different kind of day. They walk in the morning, they get an email, and they want to get immediate answers to the things that they're working on. And to interact with the makers provides or causes this conflict because they work in very different modes. So let's actually look at a couple specific types of people that I see when I work in different collaborative softwares or different collaborative tools, because these are the kind of folks that you're going to experience. And what's interesting is that you may know somebody really well. They might sit right next to you, and you see them as a type of person, but then their voice or their personality on the collaboration tool is different than that, just like somebody through email might be different. So there's the professional. This is, in my mind, the perfect person. This is the person who works well in different mediums. They listen, they incorporate ideas, they speak and write clearly. The key thing that I've highlighted here is they do it with a goal in mind. Because when you think about collaborative software, you really keep in mind that, especially with business, what you're collaborating on should have a goal, right? You're not simply having a conversation for conversation's sake. You have a goal or a purpose. It's back to that concept of have a purpose for what you're collaborating on. You need a resolution to what you're providing, and this is why our software in particular focuses not just on collaboration, but on making that collaboration actionable so that it's not just a comment, it's a question or it's a decision. They're also open-minded. So for me, really, these are the folks that you want to use to sort of share their success and sort of promote that adoption that you're looking for. Then you have some other folks that aren't so professional. You have the reluctant first person. This is the person that's maybe slow to technology. They think that collaboration is noisy and complicated. They're not willing to give it a chance. They get easily overwhelmed by this different medium. Now all of a sudden they've got email, IM, drive-bys, and a social software, and so they feel like, why another social software? So they don't really believe that it provides value because they struggle with it. The way to engage with them is natural peer pressure. And this may sound harsher than it is, but there's some great articles about how you can use marketing internally to gain adoption, to sort of make people feel included. Because ultimately, regardless of how reluctant they are, they want to feel included in the process. And that takes reassurance. It takes just not forcing them. You don't want to overcomplicate it. And it also takes education. And when I mean education, it means education to all. The opinionated one is the person who's very opinionated. They throw their information out there. I tend to fall into this category. It's difficult to sort of move this person forward if they're really adamantly against it. They're so confident. They're kind of the stubborn folks. Really, the way to engage is that listen to them. They tend to have good ideas, but at the same time, you really should have good exploratory questions that force them to defend their opinions. And ultimately, they're not opinionated as much as they're stubborn. And it's about just understanding their viewpoint and making them realize that it's otherwise. It may require ultimately a facilitator or someone to override to step in. The rant, this is the person who just uses the online as a platform for ranting on something that they're upset about. These people do exist. I've had some folks, when I do talks like this in person, I've had some folks raise this concern, like, what do you do about this person? And I even have a friend of mine that works at Google, and I asked, do you have this same problem? And they said, absolutely. There's always that person or that several people who go on a rant and say things or call people out or throw people under a bus. And the reality is that's going to exist, and it exists today anyways. So sometimes the best thing to do is just ignore it. You can call them out if you want, but believe me, you're just going to end up in probably a bit of a flame war, so be prepared for that, and maybe call them out in a way that's not aggressive. Organizationally, I think that this is an area where you can really define your cultural tics and make it part of the new employee onboarding. You really, how best to engage with folks. What is collaboration? It goes back to this adoption and education. Then there's the animated GIF person, right? This is the person that chimes in for fun. They're not really providing true value. They just feel like they wanted to respond. They put these animated GIFs or YouTube videos or photos, and I think on social sites that's great. I think on, when you're dealing with business software, these types of things tend to, I think the realization is that the non-realization is that they're there forever. Right, that now what we're really promoting as part of business software is the fact that now you've got this conversation and it's providing context, and I can go back months down the road and see the conversation, and to have something like this standing in front of me is not going to be providing me much value. So the rules, in my mind, of engagement is really, be open, be clear, respect time. And what I mean respect time is that don't use it like I am. Don't use software like a drive-by. Understand the fact that when you put something out there, because it's subtly different, and this goes back to that collaboration where we're sharing information. When I share something, we all love that instant gratification. There's no question about that. But there's a slightly different mindset where you're putting something out there because you want thoughtful responses, and you've got those introverts who are going to take a look at what you put out there and think about it, and they're going to respond. So if you respect that idea of time, then you're going to get more thoughtful responses and more thoughtful participation. Educate in general, educate your folks sort of how you use it, educate how you want to use it, and have a conversation around it. Avoid or mitigate humor. I'm not here to squelch humor. I think humor has its place, but we're really talking business social software. We're collaborating for a purpose. But don't criticize when people do things wrong, because you want people to have that freedom. That's the beauty of collaboration, and there really should be no backlash for someone who's done something wrong. And again, remember, it's purpose, purpose, purpose. So let's talk a bit about productivity and just the benefits of productivity. And let's do a quick poll. So how productive are you in your organization? Are you very productive, mostly, sometimes, or not at all? And I'm just sort of curious. And again, I'm asking this poll at the beginning because I wonder what the idea or the concept of productivity is in your mind. So the results, I'm not 100% clear what those results will be. My guess is most people, well, by the way I've asked it, is when you say productive, you think as an individual. So interestingly, 0% of you said not at all productive. That's great. I would be worried, actually, if someone out there thought that they were not at all productive. So I'm seeing that at this point, most of you are saying mostly. The least amount of you are saying very. And the third, yep, so the final is 18% said very, 58% said mostly, and 24% said sometimes. That to me feels absolutely normal and about on par. Now the real question that I want to address is how do we increase that productivity? Because it seems to me that there could be more of us in that very stage. But the reality is that productivity isn't necessarily a individual concept, and I'll talk more about that. So first, what is productivity? For me, it's flow, it's rhythm. It's the fact that as individuals, we seek those moments when work is getting done in a manner that feels natural and fluid. For me, productivity is that moment in time where you're working on something and you're getting it done. It's getting out there. And this goes back to that context switching. I'm typically not productive when I'm being distracted, right? And so the sheer fact of not being distracted is going to enable me to be more productive. and there's more to that. Oops, it's not transitioning. There we go. So progress is another key aspect of productivity. It's measured ultimately by this, the fact that we're actually making progress. For me, I could sit and do something and work on something for an entire day, but if at the end of the day I haven't actually accomplished anything, or there's no real sense of closure or movement, or that I haven't received any gratitude. I know it seems petty, but receiving that gratitude around, hey, you did a great job, is a sign of progress, that you have accomplished something. It's that continued flow, and it's that ability to build on the success of what you've done before. So it's that continued evolution, or that continued building on something. And this ties again to that value of collaboration around what you're working on, because in order to do this, you want to be able to move forward with what you're accomplishing. The other aspect is this idea of busyness, the idea that, hey, we're all busy. That doesn't necessarily mean that you're productive. There are so many days that I've had where I am incredibly busy and I come home exhausted, but the reality is I did not accomplish a thing. But I'm going to challenge that a bit, because my busyness might be the fact that I'm involved in a lot of other people's busyness, and my contribution could be making them productive. And so that's something that I really want to have, or the reason that my poll may have been personalized or it was individualized. The reality is that you may be more productive than you realize. Just because you're not getting something done doesn't mean that you're not helping someone else get something done. So this idea of being busy should be discussed, because if you don't feel like you're getting anything done, you don't feel like you're productive, it's worth having a conversation about that to figure out, is that okay? Is that okay because my role dictates that I am helping other folks be productive? And ultimately, design matters. I really believe that productivity is impacted by the space that you work in, or the software that you work in. I don't think we think about that here at our company, and we really believe that space is important, and we also really believe that software is important, that it sort of defines our cultural existence a little bit, the software that we used. If we were using really clunky, old, outdated software, that's going to have an impact on our culture, and it's going to have an impact on our enjoyment and our ability to feel productive. So let's break down some of the myths, and let's highlight some of the benefits of this. So the myths, really, the big myth that I have is that there's too much noise, that it's too distracting. And what I'm focused on here is around this collaboration. And so what I'm going to go through is real quick a scenario of a bunch of individuals going through their day. And the thing I want to highlight is the fact that that when we talk about time management, because I've seen people say this, that, oh, it's too distracting. The reality is that time management, that ability to be or not to be distracted, is on some level your responsibility. Or if you really can't manage your time, then it's the responsibility of your manager to help out. The fact that I've received an email and it's distracted me from what I was working on is not because of the person who sent me the email. It's because I checked my email. It's my responsibility to set time aside, and it's my responsibility to let people know that if they don't get a response from me immediately, it's because I'm getting stuff done or because I'm being productive. That's part of the conversation. And so productivity is impacted by a lot of things: meetings, conversations, and email. And so if we look at a typical day, each person has a different kind of day. The gray represents productivity or efficiency or getting work done. And so you can see the person on the far left, maybe they're working from home, maybe they're sitting in their cube, and they're just working straight through the day, and they got a ton of stuff done. Versus the person on the right was getting some stuff done here and there, but there were moments in the day where they just simply weren't productive. And what this means is that they were either distracted or they were struggling with something because they didn't have all the answers. And so this is really where collaboration has an important concept, that it's holistic and not necessarily individual. And I'm going to walk through why that's the case. And this is where, again, going back to that poll, most people probably thought of productivity as their work, but productivity is a company initiative. It's making the company productive versus individuals. So let's say, for example, that this individual has a question and they're stuck. and they're trying to work through this item, they put it out there as a question on a social software. The question, let's say, gets answered. That has essentially provided a resolution that's eliminated a lot of their frustration and made them more productive. This is in a perfect world, of course, but this is what happens with collaborative software, is that by sharing information, we're getting answers, and we're able to move forward in a more effective way. The other benefit is that that history is shared with everybody going forward. So the fact that that question was answered, anybody can go in and find, and this goes back to that discovery, where the historical fact that that information is there, and this is why collaboration in the business world is not like Facebook. It has a relevance to it. It has a historical component to it that it should be possible for me to go back. And productivity is not just me in the moment getting stuff done. It's the organization not rehashing conversations that happen time and time again. It's the capturing of those decisions so that we don't go back and have that same conversation and have that same decision being made. It's about efficiency. And so the hidden values of this is that we're building quality because we're being consistent. It's building commitment because people know that their decisions are out there and that it's going to be tied to the context. There's alignment because everybody understands why something was done the way it was done. I, as a developer, don't need to guess or assume that the requirement was written and therefore it is what it is. If I have a question and it's been answered, it's out there. There's a sense of pride, joy, and flow associated with all of these things. So kind of wrapping this down a little bit, I do want to focus some time on Agile, because Agile, again, if you asked anybody, they would say it's a methodology or process. But for me, I think of it as a social solution. And this is, I'll dive a lot more into depth with this at the next webinar. But ultimately, when you think of Agile, remember the manifesto, because the manifesto is what it was the beginning of Agile. And it was a culmination of a lot of experiences by a lot of really smart individuals. And I always go back to the manifesto because it really highlights, again, the fact that the manifesto itself is not about the methodologies and the processes that have evolved or have been produced out of the manifesto, such as Agile, such as Scrum, such as Kanban. It's the fact that organizations and teams need to focus on these concepts and items on the left-hand side: collaboration, responding to change, individuals and interactions, over the concepts on the right. It's not a replacement of the concepts on the right, and that's why the sentence at the bottom is so critical and oftentimes forgotten, that there's value in the items on the right. They just simply value the items on the left more. There's nothing more to the manifesto other than this. You could take traditional waterfall teams and make them more agile by simply figuring out a way to increase collaboration, increase the ability to respond to change, and that's why collaboration and the technology that's available to us now is really making Agile, in my opinion, possible. Whereas over the last 10 years, we've done a lot of work to try and make it work with the technology that we had. I think it's important as well to recognize the fact that Agile can and will be messy. No one said it's going to be easier. No one said that Agile is a more fun process. By making yourselves more collaborative, by making yourselves more iterative, you're increasing the complexity. But again, remember, at the end of the day, it's about building the right product, not necessarily making it faster. Now, the reason it's messy is because people are involved, and people are complicated. They're indecisive. They change their minds all the time. They get confused easily, and they're sometimes emotional, and this goes back to that that understanding of how people interact or how they will interact in collaborative software. Organizations and teams are not all equal. We can't simply apply one process, one methodology to everybody and assume it's going to work. This is the whole point of retrospectives, is that you constantly evaluate your process and constantly adjust and tweak it to make it better for your team, for your organization, which is also going to change over time. And so you may find that at the end of a year or two that what you started off with is now completely different. That is okay if at the end of the day you're building the right product. So conversations are imperfect, and really, again, Agile is about building what's right, not about making it easier. I can't stress this enough. Always evaluate if what you're doing is you're doing it for the process or for the idea the idealistic viewpoint that Agile is somehow going to solve your problems. It's not a silver bullet. It's so much about process and people and all of that involved. So, and just to highlight this, that the difference between process and tools is that process is things like Scrum, epics to stories, Kanban, whereas tools are things like whiteboard and software. And it's just important to note that the process nor the tool can make you successful, right? It's neither one of these. It's the definition and the execution of this information by the entire team. So tying it all together, it's really ultimately about adoption. It's about understanding the difference between process versus tools versus culture. Time and time again, I've seen organizations focus so much on the process and not take a moment to understand their culture. Who are the people within their organization? How do they work? How do they want to work? How are they going to be more efficient? And what tools are they willing to adopt? Because you can't force a tool on a culture that's not ready to incorporate that. On the other hand, there's education around helping that culture evolve. And I think it's important to recognize that oftentimes you may think you have one culture, but the reality is because the people don't like technology or they're just not, they're like the reluctance, the reality is you may find that outside of your business doors, they're incredibly social. And so you may find that your culture is actually because of your tools or because of your process. Iterate on success and failures. Always, always iterate on both the successes and the failures and make sure that you're constantly improving and tweaking what you're doing. And don't be afraid to diverge from the methodology that you've defined. If it works, it works. And focus on communication and visibility as part of the process. So many times, again, people look at the process and goes, well, we're going to follow the process to the T. We're going to define stories. We're going to write stories this way. But nobody thinks about how is that process enabling us to communicate better. It's one thing to say we've tracked the stories in some software. It's another thing to say that we've provided a mechanism for people to communicate. Are we okay with meetings? Are we okay with the software being the solution? Are we okay with IM? Are we okay with drive-bys? These are all important things to consider. And again, Agile is so much about the people and being able to collaborate well. People. So finally, collaboration, people, purpose, productivity. If you're enabling people to collaborate, you're focusing on the people in the organization and how they work and how they operate, and you're considering it with purpose. You're focusing on collaboration with a purpose. You're going to find yourself being more productive as an organization, not just as individuals. And so remember, I'm going to do more talking around really taking these concepts, applying it to traceability, applying it to real data, and showing how efficiency and effectiveness is going to be driven by those concepts. And again, we're with Jama Software. We believe in building great products. Feel free to go to our website, check out our software, download it, trial it, whatever you want to do. Check out the videos. We really are passionate about making people more productive and making them more efficient by using collaboration around their information. And that's all I have. So let's take questions.
Fantastic. Thanks, Derwin. So we're going to use the last couple of minutes to answer some questions that came in. And just as a reminder, if you guys have any questions that you'd like me to ask Derwin, please use the GoToWebinar panel, and we will try to answer your questions in the time we have remaining. So we know, I know you touched on this during the presentation with kind of the rules of engagement, but what about the impact of nonverbal cues? How do these how does a non-face-to-face approach affect the quality of communication?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's differences, right? I think that there's something to be said for the face-to-face that works for some folks and doesn't work for other folks. So those verbal cues are oftentimes important for having exploratory conversations and trying to really get at something. I think that there's still a need for those face-to-face conversations when you're really struggling with trying to get to the fundamental problem what you're working on. Like, I don't understand how this is going to be accomplished. You got to use a whiteboard. You got to sort of hash it out. That's where face-to-face makes a huge difference. Using collaborative tools there's such a wealth of that, and such a benefit of that thought process that you go through when you're responding to somebody. And again, it goes back to this purpose that by having it captured in an area where we're using text, we're able to think through what the response is, and that becomes part of the requirement. Just like writing requirements, we think about how we're writing it so that it means the same thing to everybody. There's so many webinars out there about writing good use cases, writing good requirements. The same is true here, is that by writing a good response or an answer to something is going to provide value to folks down the road. And so, yes, facial cues are great, but it doesn't take away from the fact that capturing the conversation is a thoughtful and beneficial process.
Great. So we had another question come in about types of collaborators, and what's your thoughts on how to identify which one you are or other people on your team are? Do you think strength finders tests are valuable to improving collaboration?
I'm sorry, can you ask the question again?
Yeah. So for the different types of collaborators you mentioned, how do you identify which one, what types of people are in your team or yourself? You are, and then do you think strength finder tests are valuable to improving team collaboration, working together with each other?
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, there's value in understanding who you're working with. It's an interesting concept. It would be interesting to sort of have some notion of the type of people that you're working with in their profile. But that's a tough question, because I think, again, when you get into software, you get into collaboration, it's like email in that we're kind of merging onto a consistency that's somewhat toned down, whereas compared to Facebook, which is just out there, people's personality, their political views, everything about their emotion, who they are as a person comes out in that. In business social software, that tends to be toned down a little bit. So I don't think it's as much of an impact now. So knowing the type of person, you're going to learn the type of person just by the type of feedback and posts that they make. And it's no different than working with someone on a day-to-day basis. There's definitely going to be personalities out there, and that's simply a reality. And sort of understanding and accepting that and recognizing that is almost the first step, and not letting it get to you, because if you let that get to you versus the comment itself, then you're sort of having the same problem you would if you were face-to-face. If the person drives you crazy, then you sort of have to figure that out.
So I know we're about at our time limit. There were a couple more questions that came in, if we can go a couple minutes over. But one of the questions was, what should I do when my team is overly collaborative, truly noisy? How do you kind of tone down that excess noise?
Yeah, I think that it depends on the problem that's causing. For example, being overly collaborative isn't necessarily we could look at being under collaborative as being a problem. We could look at over collaborative as being a problem. It's difficult to find that perfect space. So on the one hand, you feel like your company doesn't collaborate enough, or people aren't chiming in, or the information is not being captured. On the other hand, it's too much collaboration. There's too much noise and information. It ultimately boils down to having that conversation. It's, social software is solved, or social problems is solved by cultural, social ideas and conversations. If it truly is too much, then figure out why that is. What are the things that people are doing that causes it to be too much? Is it that it's exposed to too many people? Are people chiming in that don't necessarily need to chime in? Figure out what are the areas that are providing too much, and then as a company or as a team, figure out how to adjust that. And maybe it's a possibility to focus the conversations with a core group and then expose it at a later date. there's things like that to consider. But I think that those are conversations that a team or an organization should have, but it should be done with an understanding of, well, what are we really trying to solve? Just simply saying it's too much isn't necessarily a problem unless it's that there's specific things that people are chiming in, or there's too many people and what they're saying isn't providing value, or it's not purposeful, right? Hopefully that helps.
So I think this is going to be the last question that we asked. And if we were unable to get to your question on the webinar today, we'll be sure to follow up with you offline just as a reminder. But how do we encourage team members to share their knowledge on a collaboration tool? I know you mentioned adoption, so this is kind of framed around that, I believe.
How they share their knowledge on collaboration?
How do you encourage team members to share their knowledge on a collaboration tool?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So there's different ways in which to approach that, and it differs per organization. If no one's interested, or if your whole organization, your whole culture is just new to collaboration and people don't get it, it's going to require much more of a top-down sort of rollout initiative, and there should be some piloting and really understanding of the value of it. It should be done in a way that's not feeling overburdening to folks, but really rolls it out in a way that's just like you would a new software, just like you would a new concept. This needs to be rolled out. The other side of it is maybe you have a company where a certain percentage, let's say 50-60% of the people get it and they jump in. There's going to be a natural migration into that software, and this goes back to that personality, the reluctant, where they're going to come in based on peer pressure. If everyone's working on this solution, or they're actually gaining benefit where they're working on a requirement and they go in and see that there's a conversation that took place that provided them value, they're going to see and learn that value. So it could be something that happens over time. But again, it's going to take understanding your culture and the current sort of acceptance of the concepts and the tools that are in place. There's a lot to think about there, but it's well worth it.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Derwin, for a very informative presentation. Thank you to everyone for attending today's Modern Analyst webinar. I wanted to point out the webinar along with the slides will be archived at ModernAnalyst.com within a few days. And this concludes today's event, so we hope you have a great day.
Thank you, everybody.